If you're just getting started with jazz but aren't sure exactly where to start, you need to learn these 3 jazz standards first in order to ensure your success. Let's talk about them. Before we talk about these 3 important jazz standards you need to start with, let's first talk about what jazz standards are and why they're important to learn in the first place. A jazz standard, put simply, is a song that is commonly played amongst jazz musicians. It's part of a collection of repertoire that will be sure to be called at jazz jam sessions or gigs. They could come from the Great American Songbook, which are songs from old films and Broadway shows adapted to a jazz setting, or they could be original compositions from jazz musicians themselves. I suppose it's obvious to say that they're important to learn because they're the songs that we play in the genre of jazz. But they're also important because the jazz standards will teach you everything you need to know about chord progressions and how to go about improvising over them. The more jazz standards you learn, the better you're gonna get at playing jazz. So the very first jazz standard that you need to learn is Sunny Moon for 2. So the reason you should learn Sunny Moon for 2 first is because it is a 12-bar jazz blues. And when it comes to playing jazz, the most important song form to master is the blues, because the blues is really where jazz comes from. So taking a look at the chords to Sunny Moon for 2, which is in the key of B flat, we see that we have a 1 chord, a 4 chord, and then a 5 chord, which is really the formula for any blues that you could play, rock, jazz, or otherwise. But in jazz, we add a few extra changes in there that makes it unique. So we start with that B flat 7 1 chord, we go to the 4 chord, and then we go back to the 1 chord B flat 7. Then we go back to the 4 chord in bar 5. But then we steal from a gospel trick here and we go to the sharp 4 diminished, which is E diminished 7th in this particular case, before of course going back to the 1 chord. Now the important thing to know is that the most important chord progression in jazz is the 2 5 1, which happens right here at the end. 2 5 1. And in jazz, we'll do something special to connect those together. So this G7 is actually a dominant 6 chord that connects us to the 2 5 1. So once you understand these chord progressions, automatically you're gonna start unlocking jazz harmony and work on just 12 bars of really important chords. But another reason I recommend Sunny Moon for 2 if you're just getting started is because it's a very simple, repetitive melody. And it really just is that repeated over and over again, which happens just to be walking down a minor pentatonic scale, a scale which many of us already know. So that's Sunny Moon for 2 by Sonny Rollins. Jazz standard number 2 is Autumn Leaves. Autumn Leaves is the perfect song for getting started. First of all, because it's really repetitive, both in the chord progressions, but also in the melody. Even the theme kind of just sort of repeats itself in different keys, over and over and over again. So there's not a ton of melodic content that has to be learned here. And by the way, if you need some help learning melodies to jazz standards or really any song by ear, I highly recommend getting my free guide called Learn Jazz Standards the Smart Way. I'll leave that down in the description down below. But also, if you take a look at the chord progressions to Autumn Leaves, it really is also super repetitive. And really we're dealing with 2 keys here: B flat major and G minor, although the song is actually in the key of G minor, which introduces a really important concept in jazz harmony called relative keys. We start in the relative major, which is B flat major, and then we go to what's called the parent minor, which is G minor. Hence the color coding here, blue for the relative major and red for the parent minor. And essentially Autumn Leaves just repeats these same chords over and over again. And what are the chords that are being used? Well, we have a 2 5 1, which I just mentioned is the most important chord progression in all of jazz. So once you learn the 2 5 1 in one key, you can start learning it in other keys, and you're gonna see it come up in many other jazz standards. But we also have a minor 2 5 1 in a minor key, A minor 7 flat 5, D7 to G minor 7. So Autumn Leaves not only is a simple melody to learn, but it is a perfect example of understanding major and minor 2-5-1s and relative keys, some very fundamental harmonic concepts in jazz that you will certainly come across in other jazz standards. So this one will give you a massive advantage if you learn this one and understand it fully. Jazz standard number 3 is Olio. Now, Olio is a great example of the second most important song form that you need to know for jazz, which is called rhythm changes. It's called rhythm changes because it's essentially the chord changes to the jazz standard called I Got Rhythm by George Gershwin. But many other jazz musicians, especially the beboppers like Charlie Parker, wrote different melodies over top of the same changes. Therefore, we call this chord structure rhythm changes. And rhythm changes also has the third most important chord progression in all of jazz, which is the 1-6-2-5 chord progression, which in B flat major in this case is B flat major 7, G7, C minor 7, F7, which you might notice also has a 2-5-1 included in it. And there's also variations to a 1-6-2-5. For example, you could do a 3-6-2-5 instead, putting the D minor 7, G7, C minor 7, F7, and then finally arriving at the B flat major 7. Now you'll also notice in rhythm changes that we have the same concept as in a jazz blues. We have this 4 chord followed by this sharp 4 diminished chord. And though rhythm changes can be considered advanced by some, really, if you look at it, you just need to memorize these first 8 bars, and then the second 8 bars are almost entirely identical. Then you have a B section, which is also an important thing to understand about jazz. We have something called a cycle of major fourths. So we actually start on the 3 chord, which is D7, and then we go to G7, which is a dominant 6 chord, then C7, a 2 chord, and F7, a 5 chord. But if you notice something, they all cycle in fourths. From D, G is a fourth away, and from G, C is a fourth away, and from C, F is a fourth away. And this is a pattern that emerges all the time in jazz standards. For example, going back to Autumn Leaves and looking at the 2-5, C minor 7, F7, B flat major 7, these chords also move in fourths. And then finally, the last 8 bars are just a repeat of the first 2 bars. So while there are a lot of chord changes and it can be confusing at first, you're really only mastering a few chord progressions here that repeat themselves over and over and over again. Now, admittedly, the melody to Olio is a little bit more advanced and complicated, but of course you could learn any other rhythm changes head if you would like, including I Got Rhythm, which is a little bit of an easier melody to memorize. I like Olio because it also introduces some syncopation, which is also an important rhythmic element to the style of jazz, which could be good to get right on learning with the melody to a tune like Olio. So as you're learning these jazz standards, obviously the question that's going to come to mind is, how do I go about improvising over these jazz standards? Because ultimately that's probably the main reason why you want to learn jazz standards, is how to improvise over them. So on the screen right now, a video called Jazz Improv Explained. I start from a very, very basic level and build on up, and I think you'll find that helpful. So click the video on the screen right now. By the way, if you need help learning jazz standards, we actually do this every single month in my Inner Circle membership, so I'll leave a link to that in the description down below or a button here up on the screen. Hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers.